In 1985, Audre Lorde, about whom we will hear more later today in Alexis Pauline Gums' contribution, wrote that poetry is not a luxury. She said that it is through poetry that we give name to those ideas which are, until the poem, nameless and formless, about to be birthed, but already felt. So poetry or art are powerful and they can be revolutionary, and they allow us to see things together in context, across social and environmental axes. Putin's war in Ukraine is a war on people, but also on the environment. And even though today's contributions are about the oceans, the urgencies of various ongoing social and environmental crises resonate in them. Today's title is an invitation on a voyage, Undercurrents, a journey across water, soil, bodies, spirits, technologies, and time. It is an invitation to consider the many histories, presents, and futures, both known and forgotten, remembered and repressed, real and existing only in dreams for now, as they have traveled across the surface of the oceans as well as into their depths, and as they continue to travel, shaped by the oceans and shaping them in turn. Together, we will dive into the Caribbean and West African roots and routes across the Atlantic. We will consider the ocean as a repository of memory and trauma, some of which it keeps and some of which it dissolves. The contributing artists and scholars reflect on the unevenness of oceanic connections against the abstract flows of global capital. They draw links between the urgent, ecological, present, and colonial reverberations affecting human and non-human bodies, lives, and livelihoods. They invite us to engage the senses as we swim with history and art, with poetry and sound, with spirituality and technology. I'm showing you here a poem by the Barbadian, Glasgow-based artist Alberta Whittle. The poem forms part of a video that she did for the exhibition Sex Ecologies, which Jorinda quickly mentioned in the introduction, which I co-curated at the Kunsthal Trondheim in Norway. In the video and in the poem, she centers on the shipworms that ate away at Christopher Columbus's ships. And in 1503, when he was on his final voyage in Jamaica, he wrote in his diary that his ships were riddled with holes like a Swiss cheese. And so Alberta Whittle considers these shipworms as decolonial agents. And I will leave this poem here with you while I continue to speak so you can read it and it can resonate with you. The Caribbean and West African roots and routes across the Atlantic are composed of multifaceted histories, strategies, and resistance. Together, they constitute the web network of what the English sociologist and cultural studies scholar Paul Gilroy refers to as the Black Atlantic in his book of the same title from 1993, which centers Black experience in order to, in his words, punctuate the flow of Europe-centered material with observations drawn from the dissonant contributions of Black writers to Enlightenment and counter-Enlightenment concerns. Gilroy focuses on the hybrids of intercultural and transcultural formations brought about by Black critiques of national paradigms or ideas of purity in terms of history and ancestry. His network metaphor suggests that bodies of water unite those people whose lives have been affected by ocean crossings and unsettle the fictional, if effective, boundaries of nation-states and national identities. And at the same time, he reminds us of the importance not to overemphasize the unity of migration movements so as not to minimize the experience of forced displacements, among others during the Middle Passage, as well as contemporary forms of border policing. We can find resonating concerns in the writing of the Martinican poet Edouard Glissant, whose poetics of relations center the creolization of the Caribbean as well as the West or Europe, and insists on oceanic or archipelagic fluidity over fixity. Indeed, Glissant says that the great founding books, such as the Old Testament, the Iliad, the Icelandic sagas, and African epics, are all books about exile and errantry. The Atlantic, in particular the Caribbean, hold an important place in Glissant's work. He describes the Atlantic as beginning of modernity. It holds specific histories of diaspora and forced migration. It has been the space and place across which the atrocities of the transatlantic slave trade have taken place and taken lives. It has been a site of the histories of dispossession, enslavement, and appropriation. It has also been and continues to be a locale punctuated by extractive zones, as feminist queer social science and cultural studies scholar Macarena Gomez Barres calls the sites demarcated by colonial capitalism, in her words, as regions of high biodiversity in order to reduce life to capitalist resource conversion. In the Atlantic, as well as in the Pacific and other oceans, we can witness this most recently in deep sea mining for rare earth minerals. Both Paul Gilroy and Edouard Glissant consider the uneven connections between the local and the global and place focus on hybridization or creolization, in which the other is not placed in hierarchical fixed definition determined by notions of us and them or center and margin, but as always emerging in relations that are continuously in flux. We can sense here the undercurrents to history with a capital H, undercurrents which unsettle ostensible certainties and which move against the oppressiveness of fixed identity. Undercurrents, the title of today's conference, asks us to consider the intricate connections between human and non-human bodies with and through water, bodies which are water, where technologies and spirituality are wedded, where time seeps through soil. These undercurrents leak through conceptual and physical boundaries. They dissolve borders, render them fluid, and submerge us in the process of change. And here are some exhibition views of Alberta's work. In my research, I keep circling back to Barbadian poet and historian Kamau Brathwaite. Brathwaite coined the term tidelectics, a neologism on the Hegelian dialectics that have determined much of Western thought. Tidelectics is a worldview defined not as much by land as shaped by the oceans. With tidelectics, Brathwaite proposes a different way of engaging with the world we inhabit. In his writing, Brathwaite crystallizes our European terrestrial obsession with fixity, certainty, and appropriation. Brathwaite's tidelectic writing mirrors instead the fluctuating rhythmic soundings of the waves at sea and their curling ripples as they wash onto the shores. If Hegelian dialectics describes, in Brathwaite's words, how Western philosophy has assumed people's lives should be, then tidelectics delves into deeper layers of meaning, involving a range of different readings and interpretations, for water is a transitory element, and as Gaston Bachelard has beautifully said, a being dedicated to water is a being in flux. From dead calm seas to angry tsunamis, the tide never returns to the same spot twice, and its movement is affected by several forces that themselves continuously change. Currents rising from the deep sea, the moon, the wind, and ecological conditions, as well as human impact on them, mostly impact of industrialized and wealthy nations in the global north. These forces harbor changes that complicate any plain dialectic view. And so tidelectics assumes the shape of an unresolved cycle rather than a forward-directed argument or progression, which we know so well from the tales of Western progress. I want to share one of Brathwaite's poems with you here. Brathwaite's fluid language is loosened from the rigid structures of grammar in his writing that teems with palimpsest, skipped syllables, and unpredictable syncopations. In his words, the hurricane does not roar in pentameters. His poetry is crafted on watery flux and Caribbean rhythms that are deeply rooted in post-colonial anger and hope. His poem Dream Haiti, written in 1995, collapses the middle passage of enslaved people forcefully and often deadly being brought from West Africa to the Caribbean to work on indigo and sugarcane plantations, and a contemporary experience of Haitian refugees being interdicted at sea by American Coast Guards and forcibly returned to Haiti. Dream Haiti unfolds over the pages as a visual composition where the ocean is far from an empty surface or an aqua nullius, but is space defined by the metal ships of US Coast Guards, the shackles of the transatlantic slave trade, and the pollution of heavy metals, radioactivity, plastics, and so on being dumped into the ocean. American critical ocean studies scholar Elizabeth DeLoughrey, who's with us today, has written extensively on Brathwaite, including the poem Dream Haiti, and about Atlantic modernity through what she calls heavy waters. In her words, Atlantic modernity becomes legible through the sign of heavy water, an oceanic stasis that signals the dissolution of wasted lives. These wasted lives include those of the victims of the Middle Passage, as well as refugees whom global capitalism considers redundant. What DeLoughrey calls the long-drowned history of the Middle Passage ruptures the modern reading of the ocean as a smooth surface to be traversed for colonization, migration, and trade. Indeed, she shows how the Middle Passage disrupts, in her words, the naturalizing flow of history, foregrounding a now time that registers violence against the wasted lives of modernity in the past and the present. If for the forces of modern progress and colonization, the ocean was aqua nullius, an empty space to be traversed by patriarchal colonial conquest, then today, inspired by Brathwaite and connecting DeLoughrey, the undercurrents I refer to mirror the heavy waters of Atlantic modernity. These undercurrents undo the idea that movements across the ocean are linear, even or unhindered. They are heavy, they are full of heavy metals of pollution, they are filled with lives lost at sea, they are full of grief. In her keynote lecture today, Elizabeth DeLoughrey will discuss recent refugee experiences of bolseros from Cuba and boat people from Haiti, and draw connections to the effects of the climate disaster on islands as a consequence of ongoing imperialism. DeLoughrey will engage embodied fluidity and flow while looking at the works of Caribbean visual artists Maria Magdalena Campos Pons from Cuba and Deborah Jack from San Martin, and how they develop allegories of the Anthropocene in the wake of what the American literature, or as the American literature and Black Studies scholar Christina Sharp might have it, of the Black Atlantic. Indeed, DeLoughrey has not only written extensively on Brathwaite's tidelectic poetry, but also on islands, sea level rise in the Anthropocene, radioactive militarism, the waste of globalization, and she has contributed significantly to the emerging field of critical ocean studies. While DeLoughrey draws connections between bodies of water, sea level rise, and other environmental disasters, and the terrors of the Middle Passage, as well as contemporary forms of migration, the artist Julien Croiset's animated video Mon corps cacasse from 2019, which we will watch together after the break, highlights the ongoing social and environmental effects of environmental colonialism or the plantation in the Caribbean. Beginning with sugarcane and coffee fields, its colonial violences continue today, among others, aftermaths in the form of chlordicone pesticides used in plantations to combat the banana weevil in Martinique and Guadeloupe. Chlordicone was based in France in 1990, but continued to be used in the French overseas territories until 1993. The distance to the mainland is propped up as an excuse for the continued use of the contaminating substance, clearly considering the lives and ecosystems of those living in the overseas territories less valuable than those of the Europeans. Still today, almost 3 decades after the insecticide was banned, soil and groundwater remain contaminated, affecting marine life and people's health and livelihoods. In Croiset's animation, a computer-generated model of the chemical compound hovers menacingly over a beach. A rotten banana floats in the center of the screen. Shipping containers transporting fruits from the Caribbean to France tip over to give way to a collapse of shapes and a swirling purgatory of references, accompanied by a stomping soundtrack by the South African producer Mo Lorde. After the video, Elizabeth DeLoughrey and I will be in conversation discussing some of the points brought up in her presentation, as well as the wider implications of the connections between climate change and empire. And I invite you now to already think about questions and comments to the conversation. I think this will be a wonderful opportunity for us to share more informally. After our conversation, we will have with us on Zoom the celebrated Black queer feminist writer and teacher Alexis Pauline Gums. Gums is the author of Dub, Finding Ceremony from 2020, a collection of poems taking inspiration from Jamaican theorist and writer Sylvia Wynter, telling the stories of ancestors, whales, and corals, as well as diaspora, blackness, and grief. Gums also recently authored the book Undrowned, Black Feminist Lessons from Marine Mammals, a queer Black feminist meditation on lessons of survival we can learn from marine mammals. In the chapter Collaborate in Undrowned, Gums asks what we can learn from dolphin pods to replace the patriarchal family with collective schools of unlearning. And I will read this part of her chapter, Collaborate. Consider the white-bellied, short-snouted dolphins who travel in groups of hundreds, sometimes thousands. Lesson 1, roll deep. And welcome several other species of dolphins and whales to swim and eat in community. Lesson 2, better together. Though they swim across the entire planet, no scientist, or no one willing to tell a Western scientist, saw one alive until 1971. In fact, it seems there was a coordinated movement to be recognized because there were several different first sightings of the species on different parts of the planet, all somehow in 1971. Lesson 3, we can be seen on our own terms. The only requirements to be part of this massive oceanic family are that you gotta be willing to dive deep because they eat 1,000 feet below the surface. Lesson 4, do your depth work. And flock because they collectively change direction abruptly to keep humans from following them, and also move thousands of miles to stay current with the ocean. Lesson 5, be ready to transform. In her talk, Alexis Pauline Gums will draw on her research for her forthcoming biography, The Eternal Life of Audre Lorde, to share about the self-described Black lesbian feminist, warrior, poet, and mother, Audre Lorde's philosophy of the storm connections between West Africa and the Caribbean archipelago. Lorde, identifying as a daughter of the Yoruba goddess Oya, survived Hurricane Hugo in St. Croix, one of the US Virgin Islands, in 1989. At the time, she witnessed the devastating damage of the hurricane on the island, as well as US soldiers coming to the island not with emergency relief supplies, but with M16 rifles. Even though they knew very well that there was no running water, medical supplies, phone lines, or electricity. But, in Lorde's words, the first and primary mission of the US military upon arrival is to protect property. And the main aim was indeed to protect Hess Oil, a private company with government contracts and at the time the largest oil refinery in the Western Hemisphere. The largely Black and poor population of St. Croix was vilified in the media, who showed images of mostly Black residents looting from white-owned shops. Indeed, the Chicago Tribune wrote on September 25, 1989, at the height of the looting last Monday and Tuesday, frightened white residents, hotel owners, and shopkeepers began carrying guns to protect what they had left. Others fled the island in panic. And the paper continues and says that President Bush had to send in troops to help restore order. We see the same racist tropes again and again of property valued over lives. Not only that, the climate disaster disproportionately affects Black, brown, indigenous, and poor bodies in the global South. The year prior to Hurricane Hugo, in 1988, Hurricane Gilbert had destroyed Kamau Brathwaite's mountain home in Jamaica, with the violent wind loosening the roof and the mudslide flooding his archive of Caribbean poetry, art, music, and culture assembled over decades. In his poem Shar, Brathwaite calls this the shattered cess of the storm. With global heating and warmer ocean water and air currents, the number of storms that intensify rapidly from category 1 to 4 or 5 has tripled between 1982 and 2009. They also intensify faster, making evacuation all the harder or impossible also in wealthy contexts in the global north, as we have seen with Hurricane Harvey in 2017, when the mayor of Houston refused to issue an evacuation order as the 24-hour window was too short and would have placed people in an even more vulnerable position. Concerning her experience in St. Croix, a US territory where troops, not emergency relief, was sent, Lorde told the Black literary journal Colonial in an interview, "If we do not learn the lessons of Hurricane Hugo, we are doomed to repeat them, because Hugo will not be the last hurricane in this area." In her talk today, Alexis Pauline Gums will offer a meditation on Audre Lorde's photographs of the damage Hugo caused in St. Croix as a reflective surface for our oceanic theories of change. Following Alexis Pauline Gums' talk, we will take another short break and set up for the performance by artist Josefa Cham and Hugo Mirvalet. Cham and Mirvalet will plunge us into a spiritual, technological, aquatic journey inspired by West African mythologies, where divides between humans and non-humans, past and future, spirituality and technology, and other boundaries dissolve. The artists explore the mythologies and politics of the aquatic imaginary, evoking the myth of Drexia, an underwater world where the babies killed in the wombs of enslaved women that were thrown overboard the ships during the Middle Passage survive and thrive. In this underwater world, hybrid beings resist the violent world at the surface. In their Afrofuturist vision, Cham and Mirvalet invoke ancestors that the sea has restored, now listening to what history never wanted to listen to. The protagonist's body is water, is history, is petroleum, is incomplete memory, is spirit, is mourning, is breath, is resistance, is algae, is decaying, is rebirthing. I hope these undercurrents across water, soil, bodies, spirits, technologies, and time resonate with you, touch you, and drag you into the urgent to and fro of the waves as we embark on this journey together. Thank you.